So Laura, you've just written this note on South Korea, which I think is really great. What are the main points in it?
So during the late 1970s to 80s, South Korea became known as one of the star performers of the world economy, and the size of its economy since then has increased by tenfold. However, since 2011, the GDP growth has slowed significantly. So the question is escape the middle income trap, and where does it go from here?
Right. So it was one of the stars, maybe the star of the global economy for decades, right? For 30, 40 years. But you're telling us that process has stopped now, is that right?
Yeah. So the way that they grew at 8%, 9% per year, and that was the process of a rapid industrialisation. So they moved rural workers from low productivity sectors to typically urban workers to higher productivity sectors.
A bit like Japan did before.
Yeah,
and
exactly. However, the gains from productivity and increasing international competitiveness has now stopped, and growth has therefore slowed, and so has inflation. In response, like other central banks have, they have decided to cut interest rates dramatically and are now at negative real rates.
Why do you think growth has stopped? Is it to do with rates being too high and demand being too weak, or is it something else going on?
So the easy gains from productivity has now stopped. So productivity growth in the service sector for the last 14 years has stagnated completely.
Right.
In the manufacturing sector, it's stagnated for the last 6 years.
I suppose there's really still a manufacturing economy mainly though, is that right?
Yes. And the problem is these big, large, family-run conglomerates, which are very inefficient zombie companies, are being kept alive by the government.
Right.
And
what do you mean by a zombie company?
so they are very unproductive and inefficient. They benefit from having easy credit from base rate interest rates, but they're still kept alive, where they should really go to bankruptcy and let other smaller new firms, which are more productive, enter the market.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So what's the government Moon, is that correct? What are they doing about it?
So President Moon was elected in May following Mark Park being impeached last year, and equity markets have taken it well, consumer confidence has picked up, and he's come in on the promise of higher employment and clamping down on corruption of these big conglomerates, and started to enact fiscal stimulus since it's been in play. Yeah, so this stimulus package is going to help those zombie companies which do fail to revive themselves.
Doesn't sound like a good idea
it's
to me.
the
Is that
complete
what
opposite of what we would suggest for them to do. So not just for South Korea but for other countries, we say that part of the prescription, so this medicine that has been prescribed to so many advanced economies around the world, is to cut interest rates, but that's worsening the supply side of the economy.
How does that worsen the supply side?
Because it keeps these zombie inefficient companies alive.
So the medicine that's being prescribed in South Korea is even lower rates and more subsidies to the zombies, to revive the zombies, to keep the zombies going. That's not going to help productivity, is it?
No, exactly. However, there are some signs. So productivity is also made up of the gains in employment growth, and this year the the working age population peaked in South Korea, which is automatically going to reduce productivity growth.
When you say productivity is helped by gains in employment growth, you mean GDP per head of population is helped by that, not productivity per person employed.
Yeah, so one way which President Moon is going to help that is youth unemployment at the moment is 10 to 12% relative to the rest of South Korea, which is around 4%. Also, there is a very weak female labour participation rate, so what they're going to do is help females get back into the job market, increase childcare, for example, and encourage youth workers back to the job market as well. So that should help to increase employment growth.
Okay. Is that a policy that's worked in other countries? Can you point to anywhere else where that type of policy has worked? In Japan, they tried it, right?
Yeah, but it's not helped their long-term problems. It's not going to help the high debt, low interest rate. there needs to be much deeper structural reforms and increasing interest rates for that to happen.
And the other thing that's characteristic of many other economies around the world, whether developed or emerging economies like South Korea has been for a few decades, is a lot of them have a very high level of debt across the economy. Is that true in South Korea also or not?
Yes, so debt there is over 200% of GDP.
Right.
And
that's total debt, right? Not just government debt.
Total debt. So government debt, interestingly, is actually very low.
Right.
So it's 60 percentage points lower than the average of the OECD,
right.
at 40% of GDP.
Right.
So they do have the fiscal space to help the economy. But in terms of its total debt, which it's got very high corporate and household debt, household debt in particular is a big concern. And what we found is that when you reach the 250% share of GDP barrier, then you start to get less bang for your buck. So every pound of credit gets a much lower return. Right,
and if we think back in the case of Japan, which I think is quite a good example for what's happening in South Korea, Japan started out in the late 1980s, early 90s with government debt very low as a share of GDP, but it's now 250% on its own, just the government side, never mind the rest of the economy. Is that what do you think is in store for South Korea too?
Yes, so they want, a lot of the forecasts at the moment are saying they expect South Korean GDP to pick up because of strong consumer growth. Strong consumption growth. However, because household debt is so high, that seems unlikely. So it seems likely the government will step in, increase its own balance sheet, subsidising others in order to increase growth, but only for the short term. That's not going to help with the long term.
And that's exactly what Japan did for decades without any impact on productivity growth across the EU. Is this the end of the road then for South Korea? Has South Korea stopped being the star performer? Has it started being something more like we've come to expect in Japan, that kind of thing?
So for now, there is a short-term boost to the economy. As we said, President Moon's in. He will help with his fiscal loosening packages. Interest rates will remain low. Also, it's exports as a share of GDP of 50%. It looks like global growth. We're in a boom time at the moment for the next 2 to 3 years. That should help the South Korean economy for now.
Exports especially.
But long term it needs to sort out its low interest rates, and it's now negative wage growth and weak productivity growth.
It needs to deal with the zombies, right? In the way that Japan hasn't done for 25 years and counting. How do you do that? What do you think, if you were the benign dictator of South Korea, what would you do next?
So its large conglomerate firms need to be shut down, those that are unproductive. That's the main problem. If that's one of the reasons why they are so weak in productivity growth, that's going to be the least popular thing to do, which have very strong links to the government. And Moon doesn't have a majority in the government. It needs to gain the other politicians and other parties to get laws through. So fiscal loosening has been passed, but that's quite an easy one to get through. But shutting down these big conglomerates is not going to be popular. Those reforms which need to be enacted, increasing interest rates at a time when there's very much weaker growth than there has been in the past, is not going to be popular.
So do you think there's any prospect that realistically that they're going to do it?
I think short-term pickup, but long-term, I'm not sure that Moon will actually get the policies he needs through Parliament. So
Japanification is the likely prospect in the long run for South Korea?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.